1. Isolation Horror, the sound in the walls. Amanda had rented a remote cabin for a weekend getaway. It was quiet, too quiet. The air felt thick with the silence of the forest surrounding her. The first night, she noticed the strange sound. At first, she thought it was the house settling, but as the hours passed, it grew louder. Scratch, scrape, tap. It came from the walls. Thinking it was perhaps animals in the walls, Amanda tried to ignore it, but the sounds only got worse. The next morning, she searched the cabin, tearing up floorboards, knocking on walls, but found nothing. Still, that night, the scratching grew frantic, almost desperate. When she checked the bathroom mirror, she saw a faint handprint on the foggy surface, and underneath it, "Help me." Terrified, Amanda ran outside, but when she looked back at the cabin, she saw a face pressed against the window, eyes wide and pleading. It was her face. 2. Paranormal Horror, Room 217. When Thomas checked into the rundown motel, he was told by the grumpy clerk, "Room 217's off limits, but if you're in a hurry, it's available." Feeling adventurous, Thomas decided to stay there, intrigued by the forbidden room. That night, he heard soft whispers coming from behind the wall. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then a sudden knock on the door made him jump. Opening it, he found nothing. Returning to bed, he could hear a faint voice from the other side of the wall. It sounded like someone whispering his name, followed by a soft, breathy laugh. The walls began to shift, the sounds growing louder. Suddenly, a face pressed against the wall from the other side. It was mangled, distorted, but its eyes were unmistakable. It was his own reflection. 3. Psychological Horror, the mirror on the shelf. Daniel was always alone. He worked from home, avoided social situations, and kept to himself. One day, while cleaning out his grandmother's attic, he found an old mirror. Small, dusty, and cracked, it seemed like an odd thing to keep, but something about it made him hold onto it. Over the next few days, Daniel began to notice strange occurrences. He'd see things in the mirror that weren't in the room. The reflection of himself was sometimes off, his movements weren't synchronized. The longer he stared, the more distorted it became. The reflection started to smile without him, its expression becoming twisted, mocking. Then one night, he saw it clearly. His reflection didn't move at all. He did. He tried to look away, but the reflection wouldn't let him. It began to speak, "You're the one who's not real, Daniel." And as he stared, his reflection's eyes went black. 4. Survival Horror, the collapsing tower. Lena and her team of archaeologists were exploring the ruins of an ancient temple when the ground beneath them gave way. The building collapsed, trapping them in a network of dark, crumbling tunnels. The walls were unstable, threatening to cave in at any moment. The air was thick with dust and the sound of falling debris. As they attempted to navigate through the collapsing maze, something far worse began to stir beneath the ground. At first, it was just strange noises, scraping, shuffling, the occasional moan, but then they saw it. Something long and thin, slithering through the cracks, its movements unnatural. It wasn't human. It was something worse, something ancient and hungry. With every step they took, the ground beneath them trembled. Time was running out. The walls were closing in, and the creature was hunting them. One by one, the team disappeared into the darkness, screaming as they were dragged below. Lena was the last, and as she turned to face the creature, it whispered, "You're already dead." 5. Body Horror, the change. Adam woke up one morning feeling unusually stiff. As he moved, his joints crackled and popped, but it was nothing more than a strange ache. He shrugged it off. Over the next few days, however, his body began to change in ways he couldn't explain. His skin started to stretch, the muscles beneath it shifting unnaturally. His bones grew longer, and his teeth, sharper. At night, he would hear his own voice calling to him from the mirror, but when he looked, it wasn't him standing there anymore. It was something else, something grotesque, something that wanted to be free. In a panic, he tried to escape the transformation, but each day, he looked more like the creature he had seen in the mirror. And then, one day, the creature spoke to him, its voice his own. "You're no longer Adam. I am." 6. Creature Horror, the deep ones. Maggie, a marine biologist, had always been fascinated by the ocean's depths. She joined a research team on an expedition to explore an uncharted trench. What they found there was beyond anything they expected. At first, it was just unusual marine life, creatures that looked like ancient fish. But as they went deeper into the trench, things started to feel off. The sea grew colder, the pressure heavier. And then, they saw it. A massive, dark shape, a creature that could only be described as ancient and otherworldly, stirring deep beneath them. It began to rise, the water around them roiling violently as its form emerged. With long, scaled limbs, eyes that glowed like lanterns, and a mouth filled with sharp teeth, it was far more than any monster from myth. Maggie tried to call for help, but the creature was already pulling the team into the depths, one by one. And the last thing Maggie heard before everything went dark was the whisper of the creature's voice. "You are nothing." 7. Urban legend hoarder, the man in the wall. Sarah had always heard the stories, the man who lived in the walls of the old apartment building. He was a ghost, or worse, an urban legend told to scare the tenants. But Sarah never believed it. That was, until she started hearing things in the walls. At first, it was just the creaking of old pipes, but then it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate. And then, one night, a whisper. "Sarah, you're not alone." Terrified, she called the landlord, who reassured her that the apartment was safe. But when she went to check the wall, she found something worse than she could have imagined, a human-sized hole, where a pair of hollow eyes stared out from the darkness. And then, just as she was about to scream, a cold hand reached out and dragged her into the wall. 8. Folk hoarder, the harvest. Ellen had recently moved to a small village in the country to escape the fast pace of city life. The people were strange, but kind, and the old traditions of the village fascinated her. They spoke often of the harvest, an ancient ritual that happened once every decade, where the village gave thanks to the land for its bounty. But as the day of the harvest grew closer, Ellen began to notice things that didn't make sense. People's faces would become strained, as if they were afraid of something. Children disappeared for days, only to return with blank stares. The night of the harvest arrived, and Ellen was invited to the village square. She stood silently as the villagers circled around an altar, chanting softly. Then they turned to her. She was the offering. As they began their ritual, she saw the truth. The harvest wasn't a thanksgiving, it was a sacrifice, and she was the crop. 9. Revenge hoarder, the unfinished business. When John was a teenager, he'd made a mistake. A horrible mistake. He'd been part of a prank that went terribly wrong, leaving a fellow student, Tom, dead. The guilt had haunted him for years, but no one else knew. Now, years later, John had moved on. He had a family, a career, and no one talked about Tom. But one night, John began receiving strange messages, texts, voicemails, and even letters in his mailbox. "You're going to pay." Then, one by one, people from his past began dying in horrific ways, each one a victim of the prank they had played on Tom. The messages continued, growing more twisted and violent. John knew Tom was back, but he couldn't escape. The last message he received read, "You can't outrun me." 10. Lovecraftian hoarder, the fractured sky. Dr. Maria Wells, a brilliant scientist, was part of an expedition to study an anomaly in the sky. An inexplicable rift appeared, like a tear in reality itself. At first, it was just a curiosity, but then things began to unravel. As they got closer, reality itself started to break down. Time warped, the stars shifted, and the ground beneath them trembled. The sky tore wider, revealing visions of things that shouldn't exist.